Hi everyone, my name is Mindy Johnson and I will be your instructor for EXS 216, Anatomy and Physiology. Throughout this course you can expect 6 modules. Each week we will cover a new module, the first 5 being content heavy, and the 6th one will occur during finals week. Following each module you will be tested, you'll be given an exam. Module 1 will cover chapters 1 through 5. This video will introduce chapter 1, and in the video that follows this one, we will finish chapter 1. You have been given a list of objectives and questions. You should use those to guide your studies. And if you are able to answer those questions or complete the objectives, then you should be in good standing for the exams. This video will cover the first half of those objectives and questions for chapter 1. We will first begin by simply defining anatomy and physiology, and then we will get into the different levels of structural organization in the human body. And then from there, we will introduce the 11 body systems. We will cover the organs and structures that make up each system as well as their functions. And then we will finish up by introducing the language of anatomy. You will learn many new directional terms. You will learn how to apply them to describe the human body and the relationships between different anatomical structures. If at any point in time you have questions throughout this course about a video, about the objectives and questions, please email me at johnsonml@uncw.edu. In Chapter 1, Orientation to the Human Body, we will start by defining anatomy and physiology. From there, we will move into the structural organization of the human body. We will introduce the 11 body systems. We will discuss their organs and structures that comprise them, as well as their functions. And then lastly, we will finish up by introducing the language of human anatomy by talking about anatomical position and coming up with many new terms that we will use to describe the location of anatomical structures as well as their relationships to surrounding structures. So first, let's define anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is the structure of the human body, whereas physiology is the function. Oftentimes I think of anatomy as the what and physiology as the how. So for example, anatomy, you could pick on the heart, for example. We can look at the structure of the heart, how it has different chambers and valves. And then the physiology of the heart, which is the function of the heart is to pump blood. So when we study the physiology of the heart, we will look at the different cells that interact with each other to allow for the heart to contract and then force blood throughout it as well as throughout the rest of the body. Anatomy can be studied several different ways. Usually programs will study anatomy systemically or regionally. In this class, we will look at anatomy and physiology based on system. For example, the skeletal system, the muscular system, the cardiovascular system. Sometimes people study anatomy regionally. For example, you can study the region of the upper limb, which includes the arm and the forearm. When you study anatomy regionally, you look at everything in that one region. You'll look at the bones, you'll look at the muscles, you could study the blood vessels as well as the nerves. In this class, we will study it systemically. We will cover 5 to 6 body systems, and then you will see the remainder of the body systems in the follow-up course, EXS 217. To study physiology, we just name that area of physiology based on the organ system. So if you are looking at The urinary system, you're looking at the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder. That would be categorized as renal physiology. Oftentimes, programs or colleges will teach anatomy and physiology as separate courses. However, it is quite impossible to talk about one without mentioning the other. And that is due to this principle of complementarity of structure and function. The function will always reflect the structure. And the example that is provided on the screen for you includes the muscular system. On the left-hand side, you are looking at the muscles of the shoulder complex as well as the upper limb. On the right-hand side, you are looking at a microscopic view of a muscle cell or of a muscle fiber. Next, we are going to look at the levels of structural organization. We can arrange the human body along different levels, starting from really small and working our way to very large. The smallest level of the human body is the chemical level. This is where we see atoms come together to form molecules, and then eventually molecules come together to form organelles. An organelle is a little organ, which we will see many different organelles come together to create the next level, which is the cellular level. An organelle is a little organ that allows the cell to carry out its functions and continue living. The cellular level is important because that is the smallest functional unit of the human body. It's able to carry on life without anything else around it. When we put cells together, those cells that have similar structure or similar function, we create the tissue level. So a tissue includes cells that are similar in structure and or function. Throughout the course, as well as EXS 217, we will see that there are 4 primary tissue types in the human body. We have epithelial tissue or epithelium, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. From those 4 tissue types, when we put 2 of them or more together, we create an organ. Examples of organs will be the brain, the heart, the stomach. When we have multiple organs come together that are similar in function or assist the body in carrying out a function, we create an organ system. And we will see that we have 11 organ systems which make up the organism or the human body. The organ systems that we will cover throughout EXS 216 as well as EXS 217, the integumentary system, skeletal, muscular, cardiovascular, respiratory, nervous, endocrine, digestive, urinary, and reproductive. When you put all of those systems together, again, you create the human body. If you are more of a diagram person or you like a visual reference, this slide is for you. Starting at the left upper corner, we see the smallest level of structural organization being the chemical level. Again, that includes atoms, which we combine to form molecules, which we will eventually use to create organelles or little organs. From there, we move on to the cellular level. A cell, again, is the smallest unit of life. It is able to carry on life on its own. From there, when we group together cells that are similar in structure and or function, we create a tissue. Again, there are 4 primary tissue types in the human body: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. When we put 2 or more tissue types together, we create an organ. So by definition, an organ will include 2 or more tissue types. The organ that they have shown you is actually a blood vessel. Blood vessels are considered organs because they include epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, as well as connective tissue. When we put together organs that carry out similar functions, we create an organ system. In this case, on the slide, you will see the cardiovascular system, which will include the heart, the blood vessels, and not pictured, the cardiovascular system also includes blood. When we put together all 11 body systems, we create the organism, or the human body. In the next part of this lecture, we will introduce the 11 body systems. We will discuss the organs and structures that comprise each system, and we will also address the function or functions of the body systems. The very first body system is the integumentary system, and this is the first one that we will cover in this course. When looking at major components, these components can be organs or other structures. In this case, the integumentary system includes skin, the accessory structures being oil glands, sweat glands, hair, and nails. The integumentary system functions to protect the body, usually from the external environment. The integumentary system is able to regulate temperature by producing sweat to cool the body, or to initiate muscle contraction or shivering to increase body temperature. The integumentary system is also responsible for eliminating waste, such as sweat. And then lastly, it functions in sensation. The skeletal system now includes the bones, and the diagram to the right, you see the spine, which we will now refer to as the vertebral column. You see several ribs, which help to form the rib cage. You also see the hip bones as well as the bones of the thigh, known as the femur. But you may not realize that the skeletal system also includes cartilage, tendons, ligaments, and joints, such as the shoulder or the knee joint. All of these organs and structures come together to support these 5 main functions. The first one being support. If you think about soft tissue, such as organs like the urinary bladder or the brain, bones support those organs. Your skeleton also keeps you upright. The skeletal system provides protection. As previously mentioned, the brain is encased in the skull. The skull is a collection of bones in your head. You also have your rib cage. Inside of your rib cage, you find your lungs as well as your heart. Leverage, the skeletal system. So muscle attaches to bone. When muscle contracts, it moves bone, producing leverage. Hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is the formation of all blood cells, or red blood cells. In our bones, we produce blood cells, which is hematopoiesis. The skeletal system is also responsible for mineral and energy storage. Our bones are responsible for storing calcium phosphates, which give bones their hardness and their durability. Bones are also able to store energy in the form of fat. Next, we have the muscular system. The muscular system includes the 3 different types of muscle tissue. Remember, muscle tissue was one of the 4 primary tissue types in the human body. And there are actually 3 different kinds of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. When we get to the muscular system, we will study each of these in greater depth, but for now, skeletal muscle attaches to the skeleton. Different examples of skeletal muscle that you might be familiar with include the biceps brachii and the quadriceps. The second type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle. When you hear cardiac, you should think heart. You will find cardiac muscle tissue in the heart. And then lastly, smooth muscle. We find smooth muscle in the walls of hollow organs. For example, the stomach, your respiratory airways, and the urinary bladder. All three types of muscle are responsible for producing movement, whether that's movement of the skeleton, movement of blood throughout the heart, or movement of food through the digestive tract. And then lastly, muscle is capable of producing heat, also known as thermogenesis. So if you are outside in the middle of winter and you begin to shiver, shivering is caused by quick muscle contractions. And your muscle does that because a byproduct of contraction is heat, so heat production. Next, we have the nervous system. The nervous system includes the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves coming off of the brain and spinal cord. All three of those organs and structures allow for communication throughout the body, as well as maintaining homeostasis. And we will address homeostasis in just a little bit. We have the endocrine system. The endocrine system is comprised of different glands and cells that produce hormones. For example, the thyroid gland in the neck, the pituitary gland in the brain, as well as the pineal gland, which is also found in the brain. The endocrine system functions the same way as the nervous system. The nervous system and the endocrine system work hand in hand to allow for communication throughout the body, as well as maintaining homeostasis. Next, we have the cardiovascular system, which you may see referred to as the circulatory system at times. The cardiovascular system is made up of the heart, blood vessels, and blood. All three of those organs and structures function for transportation, whether that's transporting respiratory gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, transporting nutrients and waste throughout the body, as well as hormones that were produced by the endocrine system. Next, we have the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system will include lymph vessels, lymph nodes, thymus gland, tonsils, and spleen. All of these components allow for fluid control or swelling throughout the body, filtration, and immunity. The respiratory system. The respiratory system includes the nasal cavity or your nose, the pharynx, which is your throat, the larynx, which is your voice box, your trachea, the bronchi or your airways, and eventually your lungs. All of those structures allow for gas exchange. So the respiratory system takes in oxygen and expels carbon dioxide. The digestive system is made up of the alimentary canal, salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. The alimentary canal is one long continuous tube from beginning to end. It includes structures such as the oral cavity or the mouth, the stomach, as well as the intestines. The other four components are considered accessory organs. They lie outside of or adjacent to the alimentary canal, but they contribute to the overall functions of the digestive system. The functions of the digestive system include mechanical and chemical breakdown of food. We see mechanical breakdown in the oral cavity with the teeth and the tongue. We also see mechanical breakdown of food in the stomach. Chemical breakdown we see throughout the entire alimentary canal, starting with the oral cavity and continuing down into the stomach and the small intestine. The purpose of breaking down food mechanically and chemically is that so the body is able to absorb those smaller particles or the building blocks of what we have ingested. And then lastly, the digestive system is responsible for solid waste removal. The urinary system, it will include the paired kidneys, a left kidney and a right kidney. Extending from each of those kidneys, we have a ureter. A ureter is a long muscular tube that will transmit urine after it is produced in the kidney to the urinary bladder, where it will be stored and then eventually expelled throughout the body via the urethra. The functions of the urinary system include filtration. The job of the kidney is to filter blood and to ultimately form urine. And lastly, the urinary system is responsible for elimination. The reproductive system is divided into male and female. The major components of the reproductive system seen in the male include the testes, the penis, the duct system, and glands. The major functions of the reproductive system are the same for both male and female for the most part. But overall, we will see the production of hormones. In the male, we will see the production of testosterone, and then the formation of germ cells in the form of sperm cells. The female reproductive system will include organs and structures such as the paired ovaries, the uterine or fallopian tubes, the uterus, the vagina, and external genitalia. We will see the female reproductive system produce hormones like estrogen and progesterone. The ovaries in the female are responsible for producing eggs, which is a germ cell. And then lastly, the uterus in the female will house the developing fetus. Next up, we have homeostasis. We have to address this idea of homeostasis before we move throughout the rest of the course. Homeostasis is this body's ability or the body's ability to exist in this dynamic state of equilibrium. What this means is that there is a set range where the body is happy and it functions properly, but if something goes haywire and the body moves too far out of that range, either below the range or above it, that is a disruption in homeostasis. So we are free to move within that range, whether it's up a little bit or down a little bit, and the body will still function as it should. When looking at homeostasis or the control of certain variables in the body, we have three components. An example of a variable would be blood sugar or body temperature. There are three components, the first being the receptor, the second, the control center, and lastly, the effector. In this case, the receptor will detect that change in the variable, or it will detect the stimulus. For example, if you experience a drop in blood sugar, the receptor will detect that in the bloodstream. If you experience an increase in body temperature, the receptors in the skin or throughout the body would detect that disruption in homeostasis. The control center receives the signal from the receptor. Usually the control center is the brain and spinal cord or the nervous system. You increase in body temperature, the receptor then goes to tell the brain and spinal cord about that stimulus. You experience a spike in blood sugar after consuming a dozen donuts, the receptor tells the brain and spinal cord about that. And then from there, the control center or the brain and spinal cord will send a signal to the effector to elicit a response to account for that variable or to account for that change in homeostasis. In this case, an increase in body temperature would result in perspiration or in sweating. An increase in blood sugar would stimulate accessory organs like the liver and muscle to take up that sugar and store it to clear the bloodstream of it. When looking at homeostasis and these variables, we have two different types of feedback, negative and positive. Negative feedback is most commonly used throughout the body, whereas positive feedback can be identified in one or two instances in the human body. The last couple of examples that I just gave you regarding blood sugar and body temperature are great examples of negative feedback. Negative feedback is when we have a stimulus and our response is to either reduce it or turn it off. So for example, we increase our body temperature, the production of sweat allows for that heat to be dissipated or evaporated off of the skin, thereby bringing body temperature back down to a homeostatic level. Positive feedback, however, is when we have a stimulus and the body's response is to enhance that or to increase it. And in the next couple of slides, we will see examples of each of these. In this slide, we are looking at negative feedback as it relates to body temperature. In the center of the image, you will see a teeter-totter. That teeter-totter where it says balance is going to be our variable. In this case, the variable is body temperature. If you follow the teeter-totter in a clockwise direction, the teeter-totter begins to drop and we see an imbalance or a decrease in body temperature. The receptor, that first component of homeostatic control, is found in the skin. Those cells or those thermoreceptors detect that decrease in body temperature and carry that signal or carry that information to our second component, which is the control center, usually the brain and or spinal cord. The brain receives that message regarding a decrease in body temperature and sends a signal to skeletal muscle. A byproduct of muscle contraction is heat. So when you're cold, you begin to shiver. Skeletal muscle is responsible for that. And by shivering or quick muscle contraction, we see an increase in body temperature, bringing that teeter-totter back up to a balancing point. We can also go the opposite way. So if we see that teeter-totter go up, we see an increase in body temperature. The same receptors in the skin that detect temperature are stimulated. They will then send that signal to the brain or the control center, and the control center will send a signal to the effector to elicit a response. In this case, the effector will be the sweat glands in the skin. Their job is to produce sweat, which will allow for the dissipation or evaporation of heat, bringing body temperature back down to a stable point. Again, this is a prime example of negative feedback where we have a stimulus and the response is to either reduce it or turn it off. Next, we have an example of positive feedback, and earlier I had mentioned that we really only see positive feedback in one or two cases in the human body. One of those seen on your screen is breaking a blood vessel. You fall, you scrape your knee, and you actually damage the blood vessels in the skin on the front of your knee. So what happens is once you break or tear that blood vessel and it begins to leak blood, we have certain cells and molecules that are going to move towards that area of injury to seal the break or to seal the tear to reduce the flow of blood out of the vessel. And as those platelets or as those cells and chemicals reach the area of injury, they actually stimulate the release of more chemicals and of more platelets. So we can ensure that that tear or that break is entirely sealed off. So again, a positive feedback mechanism is when we want to enhance or increase the stimulus. Next, we are going to introduce the language of anatomy. Throughout this course, we will use many new terms to describe organs and structures as well as their relationship to one another or their location in the body. Prior to doing that, though, we have to establish this standard reference point that we will call anatomical position. We use anatomical position as a standard reference point. It's that point in which we are able to describe relationships between structures as well as their locations to one another. Anatomical position is characterized by standing upright. So the body is erect. Your feet are hip, shoulder width apart. Your eyes are looking straight ahead. Your arms are down by your sides with your palms facing forward and your thumbs out to the side. So again, the body is erect. You are standing upright. Your eyes are looking straight ahead. Your feet are hip, shoulder width apart. And your arms are down by your side with your palms facing forward and your thumbs out to the side. We will use this position whenever we describe an organ or describe the location of a structure. We will also use this position or standard reference point when describing relationships between different structures or organs. Next, we are going to get into directional terms. Again, these terms are used to describe relationships between different structures throughout the body. On the left-hand side of the chart, you will see the term. In the second column, you will see the definition. And in the fourth column, you will see an example of how to use that term. You will see this in lab where you will gain more practice with it. However, I am going to briefly go through each of the terms. The first term is superior. Another term that means the same thing is cranial. The term superior means towards the head or away from the feet. An example of where you can use this term: the head is superior to the abdomen. If you are struggling to figure out where to put this term, what structures to use with it, simply replace the term with its definition. So when you say the head is superior to the abdomen, it's the same as saying the head is further away from the feet than the abdomen. The opposite of superior or cranial is inferior or caudal. Inferior means away from the head or towards the feet. An example is the navel or the belly button is inferior to the chin. Next, we have anterior or ventral. Anterior or ventral means towards the front of the body or in front of. The example that we have provided is the breastbone or the sternum is anterior to the spine. That's the same as saying my sternum is in front of my spine. The opposite of anterior and ventral is posterior or dorsal. Posterior means towards the back of the body. In this case, the heart is posterior to the sternum, or the heart is posterior to the breastbone. Next, we have medial. Medial means towards the midline of the body. Think of the midline as a line through your nose, your mouth, your neck, through your belly button, and down to the floor, the midline of the body. In anatomical position, the heart is medial to the upper limbs. You could also say that the pinky is medial to the thumb. In anatomical position, the pinky is closer to the midline of the body than the thumb is. The opposite of medial is lateral. Lateral means away from the midline. You could say that the arms are lateral to the chest. You could also say that the thumb is lateral to the pinky. In anatomical position, we can say that the thumbs are pointed laterally, or the thumbs are pointed away from the midline of the body. The next term is intermediate. We usually use intermediate when we reference three structures. We say that a structure is between something that is more medial and something that is more lateral. In this case, the collarbone or your clavicle is intermediate between the breastbone and the shoulder. Your collarbone or your clavicle is in between the sternum and your shoulder. Again, we use intermediate when referencing three structures. The next two terms people tend to struggle with, proximal and distal. We use proximal and distal when we talk about the appendages or the upper and lower limbs. Proximal means closer to the point of origin. You could think of the origin of the upper limb as the shoulder, and the origin of the lower limb as the hip. The origin of those body parts is where that limb attaches to the trunk or to the abdomen. The example that we have provided, the elbow is proximal to the wrist. That is similar to saying the elbow is closer to the shoulder than the wrist is. You could also say that the knee is proximal to the ankle. Distal is the opposite. Distal means that a structure is farther from the point of origin. For example, the knee is distal to the thigh. You can also say that the fingers are distal to the wrist. Next, we have superficial and deep. Superficial means towards or at the body surface. For example, the skin is superficial to the muscles. Deep, away from the body surface. The lungs are deep to the skin. You could also say that the muscles are deep to the skin. Now that we have established this standard reference point known as anatomical position, we have introduced many new terms that we will use throughout this course to describe structures and their relationships to each other. We can now break the body up into regions. Overall, the body has two divisions or two main regions, the axial and appendicular division. Think of the axial division as the longitudinal axis. The axial division of the body includes the head, the neck, and the trunk. The appendicular division includes the upper and lower limbs. So it's no longer arm and leg. We have the upper and the lower limbs, or the appendages. From there, we can break up the upper and lower limbs. For example, the upper limb has two major regions, the arm and the forearm. The arm is shoulder to elbow. The forearm is elbow to wrist. The lower limb can also be further divided into two major regions, the thigh and the leg. The thigh is hip to knee, and the leg is knee to ankle. As we continue to orient ourselves to the human body, we can divide the body into planes and sections to get a better look at certain structures and organs. Oftentimes, these planes and sections are used in imaging, such as an MRI or a CAT scan. There are 3 planes, and you should know what each plane divides the body into. The first plane is known as the median or the mid-sagittal plane. The median or mid-sagittal plane will divide the body into equal left and right halves. The next plane is the frontal or the coronal plane. The frontal or coronal plane will divide the body into an anterior and a posterior part, or you could think of that as front and back. And the last plane is known as the transverse or horizontal plane. The transverse plane will divide the body into a superior and inferior part, or a top and a bottom. Next, we have body cavities. A cavity can be described as an enclosed space. We often place organs and structures within cavities to further protect them. The body can be divided up into 2 major cavities, a dorsal body cavity and a ventral body cavity. If you remember from earlier, dorsal or posterior means towards the back, and ventral or anterior means towards the front. On the left side of this diagram, you see a lateral view, so you are looking at the body as if you are standing away from the midline. From a lateral view, you are able to see the dorsal body cavity in yellow towards the back of the body, and towards the front of the body in red, you see the ventral body cavity. In the image on the right, you see an anterior view. Anterior means from the front or towards the front. From an anterior view, you are able to see most of the dorsal body cavity, but it is eventually cut off because of the ventral body cavity and the fact that it lies in front of it or anterior to it. The dorsal body cavity can be further divided into 2 other cavities, the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. The cranial cavity is enclosed in the skull and contains the brain. The other part of the dorsal body cavity is the vertebral cavity, which is found in the spinal column or the vertebral column, and it contains the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity can be also divided into 2 major cavities. The more superior part, or the part of the ventral body cavity that is towards the head, is known as the thoracic cavity. Inferior to the thoracic cavity, or below the thoracic cavity, we find the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities are separated from each other by a thin sheet of muscle known as the diaphragm. Each of those cavities can be further divided. The thoracic cavity can be further divided into a left and right pleural cavity and a mediastinum. The mediastinum should be thought of as a passageway for structures that simply move or pass through the chest cavity to get into the abdomen, such as the esophagus. Within that mediastinum, though, we find another cavity, and that is the pericardial cavity. The left and right pleural cavities include the lungs, and the pericardial cavity will house the heart. The abdominopelvic cavity can also be further divided into an abdominal cavity, which is more superior to the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity will contain digestive viscera, such as the stomach and the intestines. The pelvic cavity will contain organs such as the urinary bladder and the reproductive system in both male and female. This slide will also give you a layout of the body cavities. As seen on the right lateral view in yellow, you have the dorsal body cavity, which we now know can be further divided into a cranial cavity and a vertebral cavity. You should note that the cranial cavity is found in the skull and contains the brain. The vertebral cavity is contained within the vertebral or spinal column and contains the spinal cord. Anterior to the dorsal body cavity, you find the ventral body cavity. It is outlined in both blue and green. Remember, the ventral body cavity can also be further divided into a thoracic cavity, which is more superior or is found above the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity includes the left and right pleural cavities, which surround the lungs, and it also includes the mediastinum, which is a central passageway which allows for structures like the esophagus to simply move through the chest and enter the abdomen. Within the mediastinum, we find the pericardial cavity, which surrounds the heart. Below the thoracic cavity and below the diaphragm, we find the abdominopelvic cavity, which can be divided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity includes digestive viscera or digestive organs such as the stomach, and the pelvic cavity includes organs such as the urinary bladder, as well as reproductive organs in both male and female. This flowchart outlines the ventral body cavity for you. You should note that the ventral body cavity is separated into the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavity by a thin sheet of muscle known as the diaphragm. The diaphragm allows you to breathe. In the thoracic cavity, again, we have the left and right pleural cavities, which surround the lungs, and a central passageway known as the mediastinum. The mediastinum is not actually a cavity, but it does contain the pericardial cavity, which surrounds the heart. Inferior to or below the diaphragm, we find the abdominopelvic cavity, which includes the abdominal cavity, housing digestive viscera, and the pelvic cavity, which contains the urinary bladder and reproductive organs. In the ventral body cavities, both thoracic and abdominopelvic, we find serous membranes, which we can also call serosa. A serous membrane includes a double-layered structure that we will see covering the surface of organs, as well as lining the inner walls of each of those body cavities. So again, a serous membrane includes two layers. One of those layers, the one that covers the surface of organs, like the stomach, like the heart, we call that layer of the membrane the visceral serosa. Anytime you hear or see the term viscera or visceral, it means organ. You can think of the visceral serosa as the skin on the apple. The skin of an apple is directly adhered to the apple underneath it. We have a visceral serosa covering the wall of the heart, or the surface of the heart. We have a visceral serosa covering the wall of the lungs. The other layer of the serous membrane is responsible for lining the inner wall of the body cavity. whether that's the pleural cavity or the pericardial cavity or the abdominal pelvic cavity. That layer is known as the parietal serosa. In between those two layers, the parietal and visceral serosa, there is a virtual space which is filled with serous fluid. The purpose of that fluid is to reduce the friction produced by these two layers as they move across each other. And the organs that these layers cover are highly mobile. For example, your heart beats all day, every day. It is constantly pumping blood. Your stomach is constantly churning food anytime you eat. And as you inhale and exhale, your lungs are also compressing and expanding. So it is important that we put this fluid in between these two layers to reduce friction. We have serous membranes throughout the entire ventral body cavity. But instead of saying parietal and visceral serosa, we can actually give that membrane a special name depending on its location. For example, if we look at or study the serous membrane in the pericardial cavity as it covers the heart and the wall of that cavity, we can replace the term serosa with pericardium. So if we are just studying the pericardial cavity and the heart, the layer of that membrane that is stuck to the surface of the heart is now the visceral pericardium. And the layer of that membrane that lines the wall of the pericardial cavity is the parietal pericardium. We can do the same with the pleural cavities now. When we study the serous membrane that covers the lungs and lines the wall of the pleural cavity, we replace that term serosa with pleura. The layer of the serous membrane that covers the lungs is now the visceral pleura. And the layer of that membrane that covers or lines the wall of the pleural cavity is the parietal pleura. And we can also do the same with organs found in the abdominal pelvic cavity, like the stomach or the intestines. The layer of that membrane stuck to the surface of the stomach or stuck to the surface of the intestines can be called the visceral peritoneum. And the layer of that membrane lining the abdominal pelvic cavity wall is the parietal peritoneum. If you are having trouble trying to imagine this or picture it, think of a slightly deflated balloon. If you were to push your fist into that balloon, you now have two layers. The part of the balloon that is touching your fist, that is in direct contact with your fist, is the visceral serosa. It is adhered to the surface of the organ. That balloon folds over on itself, creating an outer layer or an outer wall. This resembles the part of the membrane that lines the body cavity wall, which we will call the parietal serosa. As the balloon folds over on itself, it creates a space in between the two layers. That space is known as the serous cavity, and it is filled with serous fluid, again to reduce friction between the two layers of the membrane as they produce friction against each other.